Hey everyone! Tonight we begin with the extraordinary life of a movement that changed not only medieval Europe but the world. It is the story of the Crusades, chaotic, brutal, tragic, and yet filled with wonders that no peasant or knight could have imagined. So before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I'm always fascinated to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease gently into tonight's journey together. It is the year 1095, and Europe is restless. The fields are muddy, the villages poor, the castles quiet. A knight sits polishing his sword, but there are no wars to fight, no tournaments to win, no purpose to his restless strength. His horse is fed, his armor gleams, yet he feels useless. The peasants in the fields are broke, too poor to rob, too weary to resist. The rhythm of life is dull, a cycle of mud, bread, and boredom. In this weary stillness, a voice rises. At Clermont in southern France, Pope Urban II addresses a crowd of nobles, knights, and peasants. His words strike like thunder across Christendom. God wills it. He promises something extraordinary. Those who march east to fight will not only gain honor and wealth, but forgiveness itself. Their sins will be erased, their souls saved. It is a sales pitch wrapped in divine light. For men and women trapped in the monotony of medieval survival, it feels like the gates of heaven opening wide. For the knights, the call is irresistible. Instead of bullying millers and squabbling with neighbors, they can now ride beneath banners, their lances aimed at a holy cause. For peasants, it is equally tempting. To leave behind cabbage soup and turnip fields for a grand pilgrimage to walk where Christ once walked feels like the chance of a lifetime. And so, across Europe, the poor and the powerful alike begin to stir. But make no mistake, this first great march east is not an orderly army. It is a tide of humanity, chaotic and desperate. Some are noblemen in chainmail glittering with heraldic colours. Others are barefoot peasants carrying pots, pans and wooden crosses. A few have swords, many have pitchforks. Children tug at their mothers' skirts, priests shout sermons in the open fields, and self-proclaimed prophets proclaim visions of glory. It is less a disciplined army and more a wandering mob, equal parts pilgrimage, carnival and invasion. Imagine the scene, a dusty road stretching to the horizon filled with thousands of people trudging eastward. Banners snap in the wind, donkeys bray, carts creak under the weight of pots and bread. There are jugglers, beggars, knights on proud horses, and peasants who have never left their village in their entire lives. And now, here they are, marching across a continent, convinced that God himself has chosen them. For the church, this is more than a holy war. It is a clever solution to a dangerous problem. Medieval Europe is teeming with restless knights, violent men with little to do but raid their neighbours. They are, in truth, a plague upon the land. But now the Pope has given them a target far away. Instead of stabbing each other in muddy fields, they will stab for Christ in distant lands. It is, in a sense, the greatest outsourcing project in medieval history, exporting violence eastward. The Crusade is also a stage. For the first time, peasants see themselves as actors in a drama larger than their villages. Knights, too, dream of fame. To ride east and fight in the Holy Land is to step into legend, to carve one's name into the chronicles of eternity. Even those who will never return home alive imagine their children one day boasting, "My father marched with the cross." Yet beneath the shining promises there is something darker. Few of those who set out will ever see Jerusalem. Many will starve long before reaching it. Disease, desertion, and exhaustion wait along the road. Yet this does not stop them. Faith is stronger than fear. In taverns, in churches, in smoky cottages, people whisper Jerusalem. Jerusalem. The word itself is magic, a dream of salvation and glory. It is not only men who march. Women pack bundles of bread and dried meat. Children cling to their mothers and priests, walk barefoot carrying relics and crosses. Some join from piety, some from desperation, some simply because everyone else is going. The crusade becomes a river sweeping up every soul in its path. Picture a knight tightening the strap of his saddle. his wife pressing a token into his hand, a ribbon, a glove, a whispered prayer. Picture a peasant barefoot carrying a staff, his eyes wide with terror and hope. Picture a child staring eastward, knowing only that something extraordinary lies beyond the horizon. This is how the Crusades begin, not with neat columns of soldiers, but with chaos. Not with clear maps or careful planning, but with blind faith. Not with understanding of the East, but with a hunger that is part spiritual, part desperate, part greedy. A march into the unknown driven by words shouted in a French field. God wills it. Already seeds of irony are sown. The Crusaders believe they are marching for heaven, but along the way, they will discover spices, sugar science, and knowledge that will change Europe forever. They march for salvation, but will stumble into transformation. They think themselves warriors of God, but they are also unknowingly couriers of culture. But for now, none of that matters. For now, the roads of Europe echo with the tramp of feet and the rattle of wagons. From castles and cottages alike, people step into history. Ahead lies hunger, wonder, and terror. Ahead lies Constantinople, Jerusalem, and legends beyond imagining. The First Crusade has begun. Life as a medieval peasant is a loop. You wake before dawn, shovel mud. Eat gruel that tastes like despair, shovel more mud collapse at night, and repeat until death. The highlight of your week might be staring at sheep or watching your neighbour get fined for stealing firewood. In this world of endless monotony, the word Jerusalem is like a lightning bolt through the gloom, a promise that life could be something more than mud and misery. So when word spreads that the Pope himself has offered forgiveness of sins to anyone who marches east, villages stir like they haven't stirred in generations. Priests preach with wild eyes. Local lords gather their men. And even the poorest of the poor people, with nothing but tattered tunics and aching bones, whisper to one another, "We could go." For peasants, the decision is not made lightly. Their entire world is a field, a cottage, and perhaps a tiny village church. To leave it is to step into the unknown, something most will never do in their entire lives. But the lure is irresistible. Eternal salvation, the forgiveness of sins, and perhaps just as tempting, the chance to escape the monotony of boiled cabbage and back-breaking labour. Picture a peasant standing at the edge of his field, mud clinging to his boots, staring eastward. His back aches from years of toil. His family is thin. His hut is smoky and cold. What awaits if he stays? Another season of mud, another winter of hunger. What awaits if he goes? Perhaps starvation on the road, but also the chance to see holy places, cities beyond imagination, and maybe, just maybe, treasure. And so they go. Thousands of peasants, men and women alike, pack what little they own. Some carry wooden crosses carved roughly in barns. Others drag carts filled with pots and pans. A few clutch relics or charms, hopeful that saints will protect them. Children stumble along beside them, too young to understand where they are going, but swept along in the tide. This is not an army. It is a pilgrimage, a flood of humanity spilling across the roads of Europe. They sing hymns, chant psalms, and call themselves the People's Crusade. But to outsiders, they must have looked like a wandering carnival priests, with wild hair shouting sermons, barefoot prophets, announcing visions of glory jugglers and beggars trailing behind. The sight would have been astonishing: villages emptied of their people, whole communities walking eastward. Smoke rising from cottages abandoned in haste. Fields left half ploughed. Dogs barking at their masters' retreating figures. It is as if Europe itself has begun to uproot a continent on the move. Among them walks Peter the Hermit, a gaunt preacher from Amiens, his eyes blazing with fanatic conviction. Barefoot, astride a skinny donkey, he preaches to the masses, his words as fiery as Urban's. To the peasants, he is a holy man, almost a prophet. To historians, he is a symbol of how desperate and unprepared this movement really was. They march with faith as their armour. They carry no supplies, no maps, no real plan. Some believe Jerusalem is only a few weeks away, as though it were the next town over. Others imagine that God himself will rain bread from heaven once they get hungry. Their innocence is as dangerous as it is touching. Hunger comes quickly. Food runs out within days. The road is long, the land barren, and thousands of mouths must be fed. They beg in towns, and when begging fails, they steal. Villagers along the route soon learn to fear the Crusaders as much as they do foreign invaders. What began as a holy pilgrimage quickly becomes for many locals a plague of beggars. Disease follows. Dysentery spreads among the crowds and bodies fall by the roadside. Mothers cradle infants too weak to go on. Old men collapse in the dust left behind as the mob trudges forward. Still they march. For everyone who falls, another grips a cross tighter, convinced that their suffering is proof of devotion. Despite misery, there is also awe. For many peasants, this is the first time they have left their village. They pass through towns with stone walls taller than anything they have ever seen. They walk into marketplaces bursting with colours and scents they never imagined. Even the roads themselves feel exotic, paved, organised, crowded with travellers. Compared to their muddy lanes back home, it is like walking into another world. And then there is Constantinople. When at last they stumble to its gates, peasants gape in disbelief. They have seen nothing like it. Walls that stretch toward heaven, markets overflowing with silk and spices, fountains with water clear enough to drink without gagging. Domes that glitter in the sun, churches that seem carved by angels. To them, it is as if heaven itself has appeared on earth. But awe quickly curdles into envy. These barefoot pilgrims, ragged and filthy, stare at Byzantines who strut in robes of silk, their jewellery flashing in the light. Constantinople looks down at them as beggars, not holy warriors. The Emperor Alexios eyes them with suspicion. He knows this is no disciplined army, but a mob that could easily turn on his city. He feeds them hurriedly, ferries them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, and breathes a sigh of relief. For the peasants, it feels like triumph. They have crossed into lands they had only ever heard about in church sermons. They believe Jerusalem lies just over the horizon. But in truth, they are marching into disaster. Starving, leaderless, poorly armed, they stumble into the territory of the Seljuk Turks. There they will be slaughtered almost to the last. It is a brutal end to their dream. Yet even in their failure, they have carried something new back into Europe. The stories of Constantinople, the visions of domes and markets, the scents of spices, the whispers of a world far larger and richer than their own, all of this will linger. Though their bones bleach on foreign soil, their memory fuels the imagination of those who follow. The People's Crusade is a tragedy, but also a spark. A generation of peasants weary of mud and turnips had dared to step beyond their world. Their blood stains the soil of Asia Minor, yet their footsteps mark the beginning of an age when Europe could no longer pretend it was the centre of the world. The crusade of peasants is over, but the Great March East has only begun. Knights, nobles and kings will soon take up the cross, and with them, the story will grow even more chaotic, more brutal and more transformative. The road east is long. Longer than anyone truly imagined. From France and Germany, from England and Italy, from Spain and Flanders, the crusading masses begin to pour across Europe. What began as speeches in crowded squares has become a living flood, a caravan of humanity stretching for miles across rutted roads and river crossings. At first, spirits are high. Priests chant psalms at dawn, villagers line the roads to watch the crusaders pass, and banners painted with crosses ripple in the wind. Knights ride at the front in polished armour, their destriers stamping proudly. Behind them, clatter carts filled with pots, blankets and children too young to march. At night, campfires glow across the fields and sermons echo under the stars. It feels like a pilgrimage with purpose, the promise of salvation pressed into every weary step. But soon the hardships arrive. Shoes wear through on rocky paths. Armour rusts in the rain. Bread turns mouldy. Meat spoils. By the second week, hunger gnaws at every belly. Mothers ration crumbs for their children, knights grumble at the absence of wine, and peasants boil weeds for soup. The mood shifts. What once felt like holy adventure now tastes like survival. Disease spreads quickly in the crowded camps. Dysentery strikes, leaving trails of the sick curled by the roadside. Lice infest every blanket. The air itself stinks of sweat, rot and fear. Some collapse and are left behind, their bodies shrouded in cloaks or abandoned entirely as the tide of humanity moves on. The road becomes a graveyard marked not with stones but with bones scattered in the mud. Still, the march continues. Faith is both burden and fuel. Priests shout encouragement, reminding the weary that suffering is holy, that every blister and every pang of hunger earns treasure in heaven. Many believe them, some do not. Quietly, deserters slip away in the night, turning back toward their villages with shame and relief. For those who remain, the journey is as much spectacle as suffering. Imagine a peasant who has never left his hamlet suddenly walking through cities with stone walls taller than any castle he has seen. Imagine a knight raised on tales of ancient Rome suddenly seeing bridges that still stand from that empire, aqueducts still carrying water across valleys. Every step is both exhausting and intoxicating. The landscapes shift. Rolling fields give way to dark forests, then to mountain passes where winds bite through wool cloaks. In the Alps, snow blinds travellers unused to such heights, and avalanches roar like God's anger. Horses stumble, carts overturn, and some pilgrims vanish into ravines. Yet even here amidst fear, there is wonder. Travellers gaze at glaciers glinting under the sun rivers, rushing like silver threads through valleys. It is a world far larger and more dramatic than the one they left behind. The crusade is not only a march, it is a carnival. Along the road, jugglers perform for coins, musicians pluck lutes by campfires, and hawkers sell bread at inflated prices. Prophets cry out that visions have told them of victory. One even claims that Christ himself marches invisibly at their head. For weary pilgrims, such words are comfort even if they ring hollow after weeks of hunger. Villages along the way are not always welcoming. Some close their gates fearing theft or plague. Others exploit the crusaders, charging absurd prices for bread or hay. Quarrels erupt. Sometimes the mob seizes what it wants, leaving terrified villagers behind. To those who watch, the endless column past the crusade must seem less a holy army and more a moving storm devouring everything in its path. Not all encounters are grim. In monasteries, monks open their doors offering bread, wine and prayers. In some towns, relics are displayed and pilgrims kneel weeping before them, convinced they have already touched a piece of heaven. Children gape at processions of armoured knights, imagining themselves one day wearing chainmail and carrying lances. For many peasants, the journey is the first time they have glimpsed such pageantry, such colour, such a mix of people and languages. And oh, the languages! French knights argue with German footmen, Italians haggle in markets, Greeks trade words with Latins. It is a Tower of Babel stumbling across the continent. Misunderstandings lead to laughter, but also to brawls. Yet beneath the noise and confusion lies something new. The awareness that the world is far bigger and far more diverse than anyone in a mud-walled village had ever suspected. As weeks turn into months, the march becomes a kind of rhythm. Dawn-packed tents sing prayers, trudge until exhaustion. Midday ration, stale bread patch blisters argue over water. Night collapse beside fires, whisper fears, dream of Jerusalem. For all its chaos, there is also a strange order in the repetition, a sense that each step carries them closer to destiny. The Crusaders are pilgrims, soldiers, beggars and fanatics all at once. Some dream of gold, some of redemption, some simply of escape. A knight whispers to his companion that he will return with relics fit to buy salvation for his entire family. A peasant tells his child that soon they will walk where Christ once walked and their lives will be forever blessed. But beneath the dreams, reality sharpens. They begin to realize how far they truly must go. Maps are rare and inaccurate. Distances blur into myth. What they thought might take weeks will take years. The Holy Land lies beyond rivers, mountains, deserts and armies. The scale of their undertaking looms like a shadow over every weary march. And yet, despite hunger, death and doubt, they keep moving. The crusade is no longer just a decision. It is a momentum, a tide too strong to turn back. Each mile eastward binds them tighter to their fate. Each night on the cold ground reminds them that their old lives are gone. They are no longer merely villagers and knights. They are pilgrims of history, carriers of a flame that will burn across centuries. By the time they glimpse the glittering domes of Constantinople on the horizon, many are gaunt, scarred and broken. But their hearts leap. They have reached the first great wonder of the East, the city of emperors and saints, a vision they could scarcely imagine when they left their villages. Ahead lies glory, envy, and disaster. Ahead lies the clash between East and West. Ahead lies the first true test of their holy resolve. The journey has only just begun. At last, after months of mud hunger and endless marching, the weary crusaders crest a hill and see it Constantinople. To a peasant who has never seen more than a thatched village and a stone parish church, the sight must have seemed otherworldly. Even knights who prided themselves on castles back home gape in disbelief. Before them rises a city so vast, so rich, that it seems less like a city of men and more like a vision of heaven itself. The first thing they see are the walls. Not wooden palisades or low stone ramparts like in Europe, but towering fortifications layered 3 deep, bristling with towers stretching mile upon mile. They glint in the sunlight strong enough to make any invader hesitate. To a crusader who once thought his village fence was impressive, these walls feel like the very edge of the world. They are not just defences, they are a proclamation. This is Rome reborn in the East. Then there are the domes, dozens of them rising above the city like great silver bubbles shimmering in the morning sun. The largest of all, the Hagia Sophia, seems to hover over the skyline, its massive dome resting as lightly as a cloud. To eyes accustomed to squat dark churches that leak in the rain, this is divine architecture. Even hardened knights mutter prayers under their breath, convinced they are looking upon something wrought by angels. As the crusaders draw closer, the senses are overwhelmed. The smell of spices, cinnamon, pepper, saffron, drifts from the markets mingling with the salt air from the Bosporus. Bells ring from towers, their tones carrying across the water. Banners of silk flutter in the wind, bright with colours that most peasants have never seen before. Gold glints from rooftops, from mosaics, from the jewellery of merchants walking along the docks. Constantinople is a feast for eyes long starved by mud and turnips. The Emperor Alexios V Komnenos is not blind to the sight of this ragged horde arriving at his gates. To him, they are not holy warriors, but an undisciplined mob, dangerous as allies, catastrophic as enemies. He orders food and supplies brought out, but he does not let them linger. He remembers the people's crusade that had already passed through a chaotic swarm that pillaged villages and died foolishly in Asia Minor. He will not let that happen again at his gates. Still, some are granted entry, and when they step inside, Constantinople reveals itself in full glory. Imagine a peasant entering the city through its gates. Cobblestone streets wide enough for carts to pass side by side. Fountains pouring clear water markets filled with fabrics dyed scarlet and azure jewels gleaming in the light. There are loaves of bread that actually taste fresh wines, that sparkle meats seasoned with spices so fragrant they make one sneeze and laugh with delight. For a man raised on cabbage soup, this is not just food, it is a revelation. The Hagia Sophia overwhelms even the most cynical. Inside mosaics glitter with thousands of golden tiles, their light flickering like a second sun. Candles glow in chandeliers that sway gently above worshippers. Incense curls through the air, carrying prayers heavenward. Crusaders stumble inside filthy and exhausted and weep openly. Some believe they are already halfway to salvation simply by standing within those walls. Yet the beauty of Constantinople is a double-edged sword. Awe quickly curdles into envy. The peasants barefoot and ragged stare at Byzantines who stroll in robes of silk embroidered with gold. Merchants wear jewels that could feed a village for years. Even their food feels insulting platters of honeycakes, roasted lamb, and sugared almonds, while crusaders gnaw on crusts of stale bread. The contrast is humiliating. Knights too feel the sting. They see the Byzantine guards armoured in polished scale mail, disciplined and proud. They see a city richer than any in the West, a city that does not tremble before them, but looks upon them with suspicion. The crusaders who thought themselves God's chosen warriors suddenly feel like poor cousins, unwashed and unworthy. Alexios plays a careful game. He demands oaths of loyalty from the crusader leaders, promises of returned lands should they win victories. Some agree reluctantly. Others bristle at the idea of bending knee to an emperor they barely understand. Distrust grows and seeds of betrayal are planted even as both sides pretend friendship. For ordinary crusaders, though, the city itself is the miracle. Imagine a barefoot boy from Normandy watching silk merchants haggle in Greek, or a woman from a muddy French village staring at glassware so clear it seems invisible. Imagine a knight tasting cinnamon for the first time, his mouth burning, his eyes watering, yet laughing in wonder. They do not yet know that these flavors, these fabrics, these ideas will ripple back into Europe and reshape it forever. But for now, their stay is short. Alexios wants them gone across the Bosporus away from his city into Asia Minor, where they will either succeed or perish, but no longer burden his gates. Supplies are loaded onto ships, banners are hoisted again, and the Crusaders march eastward. They leave behind Constantinople, but not its memory. That memory will haunt them. It will haunt them with visions of glory, of wealth, of beauty, so dazzling it feels like paradise. It will also haunt them with bitterness, for they will never forget the way Byzantines looked down upon them, the way they were treated as beggars rather than equals. That envy and mistrust will grow, eventually exploding in violence decades later. But in this moment, as the Crusaders trudge out of the city, they carry something precious. They carry wonder. They carry the smell of spices in their clothes, the glitter of mosaics in their eyes, the taste of sugared fruit on their tongues. They carry proof that the world is wider, richer, and stranger than they ever dreamed. The mud farmers of Europe have walked into a living dream, and though they do not yet know it, they have already changed forever. Ahead lies Asia Minor. Ahead lie deserts, battles, and blood. But behind them glitters Constantinople, the city of domes and walls, a reminder of how small and hungry their old world truly was. Back home, dinner is monotony. Bread so hard it can break teeth, porridge so bland it tastes like boiled sadness, cabbage stewed until it loses the will to be cabbage. Meat, if you are lucky, is salted into toughness, tasting of brine and old age. For most peasants and even many knights, food is fuel, not pleasure. You chew because you must, not because you want to. Then on the march east, the Crusaders stumble into markets unlike any they have ever seen. Imagine walking into a square where the air itself seems alive. Bright powders, red, yellow, green, black piled high in baskets. Merchants scoop them with delicate spoons, releasing clouds of fragrance that strike the nose like lightning. The smells are sharp, warm, fiery, and sweet all at once. To a crusader used to the stink of mud and sweat, this is sorcery. A merchant hands a knight a pinch of black grains called pepper. Suspicious, he sprinkles it on a crust of bread. The first bite is electric, sharp, fiery, alive. He sneezes so hard he nearly drops the bread, but then laughs. For the first time, he tastes something beyond burnt or rotten. His eyes widen like a child seeing snow for the first time. Pepper alone feels like a miracle. Then comes cinnamon, a brown powder unassuming in appearance. A peasant woman sprinkles it into a cup of warm wine. The taste is sweetness, warmth, comfort, like a memory of childhood she never had. It spreads through her body like a blessing. Tears prick her eyes, and she clutches the cup as if it were holy. Suddenly she understands why nobles might trade fortunes for these strange sticks. Cloves, nutmeg, saffron. Each new taste is a revelation. Spices are not just flavors. They are experiences, sensations that make the world itself feel larger. For men and women who thought food could only be dull necessity, this is like stepping into another reality. The Crusaders laugh, sneeze, cough, and weep as they try them. Some are delighted, others suspicious. One mutters that surely such flavors must be witchcraft. Another insists they are proof that God has hidden wonders in the East. Whatever they believe, they know one thing: their palates will never be the same. But spices are not only about taste. In these bustling markets, Crusaders see silver changing hands in staggering amounts. Merchants haggle fiercely, coins clinking deals sealed with handshakes and nods. A single sack of pepper is worth more than a peasant's yearly harvest. Suddenly, the Crusaders realize that these tiny black grains are not just food, they are wealth, power, and status. A knight begins to imagine what it would mean to carry a bag of pepper back home. No more scraping for coin, no more begging a lord for favor. With one sack, he could buy land horses, perhaps even titles. He looks at the merchants with envy, realizing that while he risks his life in armor, they grow rich with spoons and scales. This realization cuts deep. The crusade was supposed to be about salvation, but now it is also about spice. The taste of cinnamon lingers on the tongue, but its memory lingers longer in the mind. Some crusaders begin to think less of Jerusalem and more of peppercorns. The peasants are just as astonished. They taste cumin, turmeric, cardamom flavours that dazzle them, make them laugh and cry. For people whose whole lives have been defined by the dullness of gruel, this is nothing short of magic. They whisper to one another that perhaps heaven tastes like this. Perhaps God himself eats food seasoned with these powders. And yet the joy is tinged with bitterness. They know that when they return home, such wonders will be beyond their reach. Nobles may import them, kings may hoard them, but peasants will go back to cabbage and sorrow. Still, they carry the memory, and memories have power. For Europe, these encounters will ignite centuries of hunger, not just for flavour, but for trade, exploration and conquest. Long after the Crusades have faded, ships will sail across oceans in search of these spices. Empires will rise and fall over peppercorns. Wars will be fought for cinnamon. But none of that is known yet. For now, it is just a tired crusader sneezing over a crust of bread, laughing like a child, realizing that food can taste like joy. The merchants, for their part, watch these newcomers with amusement. They see gaunt men in rusting armour, filthy peasants with wide eyes clutching coins as if they are treasures. They sell generously but shrewdly, knowing they are planting seeds of desire that will never fade. In the evenings, crusaders gather around fires, clutching their purchases like relics. A pinch of pepper is passed hand to hand, each man tasting, each woman marvelling. Jokes are made about going home just to open a tavern that sells nothing but spiced bread. Dreams are whispered about trading caravans, wealth without battle. But for now, the reality remains simple. Tomorrow, they will march again, stomachs empty, feet, blistered mouths dry. The crusade is still starvation and misery, and yet now it is also something else discovery. Amidst the suffering, a door has opened to a wider world. And in the quiet moments when hunger gnaws and death seems near, a single thought brings comfort. At least I tasted cinnamon. At least I know there is more to life than turnips. This knowledge, this memory will ripple across Europe long after the banners of the crusade have fallen. If spices were a lightning bolt to the tongue, sugar was a revelation to the soul. Europe in the 11th century barely knew sweetness. For peasants, sweet meant the rare scoop of honey stolen from a beehive, or a few berries gathered in summer. Honey was treasured, yes, but it was sticky, unpredictable, and precious. The average villager might taste it once or twice a year. For everyone else, food was bitter, salty, sour, or worse, bland. Sweetness was almost mythical, a taste reserved for heaven. Then came sugar. It appeared first as crystals white and shining, unlike anything a crusader had ever seen. Merchants in eastern markets presented it in small bowls, a luxury more expensive than gold. Crusaders leaned forward suspicious. Was this salt? Was it some strange sand? Then a grain touched the tongue, and the world shifted. Sweetness spread across the mouth, soft and pure, unlike honey's earthy sting. It was clean, light, almost divine. Soldiers who had killed on the battlefield wept as if they had glimpsed paradise. Peasants laughed, bewildered, unable to believe that such joy could exist. Even hardened knights used to the taste of blood and rust closed their eyes and sighed. Sugar was not merely food, it was an experience. Candied fruits crystallized in syrup tasted like sunshine preserved in glass. Almonds dipped in sugar became treasures passed hand to hand by campfires. Syrups mixed into wine turned ordinary drink into elixirs of warmth and bliss. For the first time, Europeans discovered that food could be more than sustenance. It could be pleasure, and like all pleasures, it became desire. The Crusaders quickly learned that sugar was rare, precious, and intoxicating. A knight boasted that he would carry some home for his lady, imagining her eyes widening as sweetness touched her lips. A peasant clutched a small lump like a holy relic, tasting it sparingly, a single grain at a time. Priests warned that too much indulgence was sinful, but they themselves slipped sugar into their wine. Everyone was seduced. Markets in the east buzzed with the trade of sugar. Crusaders watched merchants weigh crystals on delicate scales, selling them for sums that seemed absurd. A sack of sugar was worth more than a soldier's armour. And yet, nobles and princes were willing to pay, for they knew that sugar was more than food, it was status. To serve sugared almonds at a feast, to sip wine sweetened with syrup, was to announce wealth and refinement. For peasants who tasted it once and never again, sugar became a memory almost painful in its beauty. They would return home to their cabbage soup and porridge, but in their dreams they would remember candied figs and honeyed almonds that melted on the tongue. They would tell their children of the taste, describing it with reverence, as if speaking of a vision. Knights, meanwhile, began to scheme. They saw sugar not only as pleasure, but as power. If such a thing could be grown, harvested and traded, it could build fortunes greater than any plundered castle. Some whispered of lands where sugarcane grew tall, its stalks pressed into syrup and crystallized into treasure. Their minds leapt ahead to dreams of plantations of ships carrying sweetness across seas. They did not know it yet, but sugar would shape empires, fuel slavery, and redraw the world's map. But in the Crusaders' moment, it was still wonder. They sat around fires, dipping dried fruits in syrup, marveling as sugar turned ordinary figs into jewels. They compared its taste to light, to love, to holiness. One chronicler even described sugar as a kind of salt of paradise. The language itself bent under the weight of their astonishment. Sugar also had another seduction medicine. Physicians in the East prescribed it for fevers, stomach pains, melancholy. Crusaders watched in awe as it was mixed into syrups and potions, treated as both food and cure. For men used to bleeding and leeches, this seemed like sorcery. The line between healing and delight blurred. And so sweetness entered European imagination. Back home, lords and kings demanded sugar at their tables, served in small dishes as rare luxuries. Monks experimented with preserving fruits with syrups for medicine. Over time, sugar would seep into every level of society. It would become cakes, pastries, candies, and eventually addictions. But in this moment on the crusade on the road east, it was still magic, still shock, still a seduction so powerful it seemed divine. One can picture a peasant gaunt from marching, holding a fig dipped in sugar. He bites his mouth, filling with sweetness he has never known. His eyes widen, his hands tremble. For that one bite, the hunger, the blisters, the fear of death vanish. He is transported, lifted, transformed. For one moment, he is not a starving pilgrim, but a guest at the banquet of angels. That is the power of sugar. The Crusaders marched for Jerusalem, but what they carried home in their memories was more than relics and scars. They carried sweetness. A single grain of sugar changed their world and through them ours. The Crusaders had expected enemies, deserts, and battles. What they had not expected was knowledge. Europe in the 11th century was a land of faith and tradition, but not of science. Most peasants could not read. Even many knights barely knew how to sign their names. Healing meant herbs whispered over with prayers, or bleeding a patient with leeches until they fainted. Numbers were tallied on fingers, debts remembered by memory, and books, rare handwritten on parchment, were treasures only monks handled. Then in the East, the Crusaders stumbled into a world that seemed to run on a different order. In Antioch, Damascus, and other great cities, they saw hospitals. Not smoky huts where a priest muttered charms over the sick, but clean, organised buildings. Rooms divided for different ailments. Shelves of herbs, instruments, even running water to wash wounds. Doctors who actually studied the human body instead of assuming every illness was caused by sin. To a crusader who had seen comrades die of infected cuts, it was staggering. One knight wounded by an arrow was brought to a Muslim physician. He expected leeches or prayers. Instead, the doctor cleaned the wound with alcohol, stitched it carefully, and bound it with linen. Within days, the knight healed. He returned to camp astonished, telling others that the Saracen doctors could work miracles. Books astonished them even more. In Europe, libraries were rare, dusty chambers tucked in monasteries holding a few dozen manuscripts at most. In the East, libraries were cities unto themselves. Thousands of volumes lined shelves, not only religious texts, but works of philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Some were translations of the ancient Greeks, whose wisdom Europe had half forgotten. Others were the writings of Muslim scholars who had expanded upon that knowledge with brilliance. Here the Crusaders encountered numbers that were strange yet powerful. Instead of clumsy Roman numerals, X's, L's, C's, they saw neat symbols, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a strange empty circle called 0. At first they laughed. How could nothing be a number? But the merchants and scholars used it with ease, calculating with a speed that left Europeans fumbling. Zero was not nothing. It was everything the key to arithmetic that would one day allow Europe to build cathedrals, sail oceans, and measure the stars. Astronomy too dazzled them. In European villages, the sky was a mystery, its stars seen as signs or omens. In the East, astronomers mapped constellations with precision charted eclipses, predicted movements of planets. Crusaders stared at astrolabes, brass instruments inscribed with circles and lines that could tell the hour of night or the direction of Mecca. To them, it was sorcery wrapped in bronze. Even the very act of writing felt different. In Europe, monks copied texts slowly, carefully, their script cramped and heavy. In the East, calligraphy flowed like art, words curling and dancing across the page. Books were not just knowledge, but beauty ink and paper woven into masterpieces. And, paper. That too was a revelation. Europeans still relied on parchment, stiff, heavy sheets scraped from animal hides. Expensive, awkward, slow to make. In the East, paper was everywhere, light, cheap, smooth, easy to write on. Crusaders saw books bound in dozens, even hundreds of pages, something unimaginable in their world. It was as if thought itself had been given wings. Some Crusaders, of course, dismissed it all. To them, Muslim learning was suspicious, even dangerous. They muttered that too much curiosity led souls astray. But others, merchants, priests, even curious knights, could not forget what they saw. They scribbled notes, carried books when they could, whispered stories of wonders back home. The transfer of knowledge was not planned. It was accidental, chaotic, piecemeal. A monk carried home a medical text. A soldier remembered the use of numbers. A merchant brought an astrolabe. Piece by piece, Europe absorbed fragments of wisdom it had forgotten since Rome. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably, those fragments would ignite a transformation. It is tempting from our view centuries later to imagine the Crusaders as pure destroyers, burning, looting, smashing as they went. And often they were. But in their wake, like seeds stuck to boots, they carried knowledge. And knowledge, once planted, grows. Picture a weary crusader sitting by firelight, fingering a scrap of paper with strange symbols upon it. He cannot read them, but he knows they mean something. He tucks it into his pouch, carries it across the sea, and hands it to a priest back home. The priest studies it, puzzled, then fascinated. Decades later, scholars translate it, and in time, it changes the way Europe counts, builds, thinks. Picture a merchant who returns with jars of spices and, tucked between them, a manuscript on medicine. He sells the spices for a fortune, but the manuscript finds its way into a monastery, then a university, then into the hands of a young student who will one day become a physician. These are quiet legacies born not of battles, but of curiosity. The Crusaders did not set out to gather science, yet they became unwilling messengers of it. By the time they returned, Europe had changed not because they conquered, but because they discovered. They carried home the scent of cinnamon, the taste of sugar, and the weight of books filled with knowledge that their world had almost forgotten how to seek. And though they could not yet imagine it, these sparks of wisdom would grow into fires that would one day light the Renaissance. The Crusaders marched east to fight, but along the way their eyes were opened to stone and sky. Back home, a church was a squat grey box of rock barely lit by narrow slits of windows. It kept out the rain, yes, but it felt heavy, dark and suffocating. A place of duty, not wonder. Peasants knelt in shadows. Priests droned in dim corners. The architecture whispered of limits. But in Byzantium, in Antioch, and further still, the Crusaders stepped into buildings that seemed less like human work and more like dreams solidified in stone. The first shock came in Constantinople at the Hagia Sophia. Its dome did not sit, it floated. Light streamed through hidden windows so cleverly placed that the roof seemed suspended on air. For men used to wooden rafters and leaky beams, it was nothing short of a miracle. One chronicler wrote that he felt the very heavens had bent low to kiss the earth. Inside, mosaics glittered like stars. Gold tiles caught fire in sunlight. Saints and angels gazed from the walls with eyes that seemed alive. Crusaders stood frozen necks, craned hearts, caught between awe and envy. How could mortals build such a thing? How could their own churches' barns with crosses nailed on ever compare? Further east, they saw mosques rising with slender minarets. Domes in perfect proportion courtyards where fountains whispered water in the sun. The lines were graceful, the patterns geometric, as if the builders had whispered with mathematics before laying stone. Compared to the blunt walls of Europe, these structures felt like prayers carved in symmetry. The Crusaders carried those visions home. They could not forget them. In time, the memory of domes and arches began to reshape Europe. No one announced a change. There was no proclamation. But stonecutters, masons, and dreamers began to experiment. First came the pointed arch, borrowed from Islamic architecture, stronger and more flexible than the rounded Romanesque arch Europe had used for centuries. Then, the ribbed vault-crossing beams of stone that made ceilings soar higher while carrying less weight. Finally, the flying buttress, a daring skeleton of support that allowed walls to grow thin and tall, pierced with windows instead of braced with stone. And with those innovations, Gothic architecture was born. Suddenly, churches did not crouch, they reached. Cathedrals rose like mountains, their spires scratching at heaven. Paris, Chartres, Cologne, Canterbury, one by one, cities transformed. A farmer walking into Notre Dame for the first time felt as if he had stepped into another world. The ceiling soared above him like a forest of stone. Windows blazed with coloured glass scenes of saints and stories glowing like jewels. Light itself became sacred. To step into a Gothic cathedral was to be humbled, to feel small beneath grandeur, to believe that God himself dwelled not in shadows but in radiance. The Crusaders did not design these cathedrals. They were not architects. Many could not even read. But they had carried visions. Visions of domes that floated arches, that sang windows that poured sunlight instead of blocking it. They had seen with their own eyes what stone and imagination could achieve. And that memory spread like fire through the minds of builders and patrons. Of course, building such cathedrals took lifetimes. A man might lay a foundation stone and die before the spire reached half its height. Sons and grandsons picked up chisels where fathers had left off. Cathedrals became the work of generations' eternal projects that tied whole communities together. But people endured the effort because they believed in the vision. To raise stone higher, to pierce walls with light, was not just architecture, it was devotion carved into earth itself. Imagine a mason standing on scaffolding 50 feet above the ground, hammer in hand. He chips away at a gargoyle's snout, the grotesque creature meant both to ward off evil and to carry rainwater from the roof. He works not for his own glory, nor even for his children, but for God and for a building he may never live to see completed. The stones beneath his feet connect him to masons across Europe, all part of a new language of architecture born of Crusader eyes. The symbolism was profound. Before, churches had told worshippers that faith was about endurance, humility, and obedience. Now, cathedrals told them that faith was light colour and grandeur. God was no longer hidden in darkness, he was revealed in stained glass and soaring stone. And all of it in some way traced back to what Crusaders had witnessed far from home. When a weary soldier returned from Jerusalem, he may have carried nothing more than scars, a pouch of spices, or perhaps just stories. Yet those stories reached masons, priests, and patrons. They inspired kings to commission grander churches, bishops to dream bigger, architects to attempt the impossible. Without the Crusades, Europe might have remained a land of squat, heavy churches. With them, it birthed cathedrals that still make us crane our necks and whisper in awe 1,000 years later. The Crusaders had gone east with swords, they returned with visions. And from those visions, Europe learned to build upward toward light, toward heaven, toward wonder. The architectural awakening was not just stone and mortar, it was faith reshaped into form. It was the Crusaders' most unlikely gift, a way of dreaming bigger than their mud villages, of daring to lift human hands toward the sky. The Crusaders had known hunger, and they had known monotony. Back home, dinner was bread hard enough to crack teeth porridge that tasted like boiled hay or cabbage stewed until its smell clung to every corner of the cottage. Salted pork, if you were lucky, carried the tang of rot beneath its brine. For most peasants, and even many nobles, food was survival, never delight. But on the long roads east, the Crusaders stumbled into markets that changed everything. In Constantinople, merchants waved strange powders under their noses. In Antioch, stalls spilled over with heaps of red gold and green. The air itself shimmered with aromas, sharp, sweet, earthy, fiery. Cinnamon curled in thin brown sticks. Cloves, black and hard as nails, exhaled perfume strong enough to overwhelm the stench of unwashed armor. And pepper-tiny, unremarkable black beads stung the tongue with fire. The first taste was revelation. A crusader took stale bread, sprinkled a pinch of pepper upon it, and sneezed so hard he nearly dropped it. But when the fire settled, there was flavor, something his tongue had never truly known. Food was no longer merely fuel, it was an experience. Cinnamon was warmth and sweetness like the memory of hearth fires on a winter night. Nutmeg was sharp, intoxicating, a taste so exotic it seemed half magical. Saffron painted dishes with the gold of sunlight. Sugar, oh sugar, was unlike anything they had ever known. Crystals of sweetness that melted on the tongue, turning the humblest fruit into luxury. For men raised on turnips and barley, it was as if they had bitten into paradise. These spices did more than change dinner. They rewrote dreams. Merchants grew rich in an instant. A sack of pepper, so common in the East, could be sold in Europe for its weight in silver. Nobles boasted of feasts where meat was dusted with cinnamon or candied with sugar. Spices became status proof that one had travelled far or traded well. To sprinkle cloves upon a dish was to sprinkle wealth itself. The Crusaders, of course, rarely understood the long chains that brought these treasures to them. Spices had travelled across deserts on camel caravans, through Indian ports, across seas patrolled by Arab sailors, and into the hands of Venetian traders. Every mile added value. Every hand added profit. By the time a crusader bought a small pouch in a market, it was already a miracle of global exchange. Back home, though, none of that mattered. What mattered was the taste and the memory. Imagine a peasant who returned from crusade with nothing but stories and a handful of peppercorns hidden in a pouch. He tossed one into a pot of boiled cabbage, and suddenly the whole cottage marveled. For the first time in their lives, their tongues tingled with heat, their noses filled with something beyond the sour reek of greens. A single spice transformed misery into a feast. Imagine a night sitting at a banquet watching courtiers whisper and gasp as dishes flavoured with cinnamon or saffron were placed before them. For once, his scarred body, his battered armour, his weary tales, all were secondary to the fact that he had tasted the East and carried it back. Spices did more than flavour food. They flavoured culture. They inspired poetry, trade, even war. Kings craved them, nobles demanded them, and merchants built fortunes upon them. To taste cinnamon was to taste the world beyond Europe, to imagine deserts, ships, markets, and palaces far away. Of course, spices were not only about luxury. Many believed they carried healing powers. Cloves to ease toothache, nutmeg. For the stomach, pepper to warm the blood sugar as both medicine and miracle. Apothecaries guarded their jars like treasure. Priests prescribed spices in remedies that mixed the sacred with the practical. But beneath all the mystery and reverence lay something simpler, something more human joy. For men and women who had lived lives of toil and sameness, spices were joy made edible, a spark of delight in a world often grey. The Crusaders had gone east with swords. They came back with fire for the tongue. And without realising it, they had set Europe on a new course. For from that hunger grew ambition. Merchants longed to cut out the middlemen to find the sources of spice themselves. Sailors dreamed of oceans. Kings dreamed of empires. The Crusades had failed in their holy mission, but they had succeeded in something unintended they had taught Europe to crave. And craving more than faith or fear can drive history forward. So the next time you taste cinnamon in your tea or pepper upon your bread, remember the Crusader who sneezed in astonishment at his first pinch. Remember the way spices turned misery into wonder. For in that moment, centuries ago, Europe discovered not only new flavours, but a new hunger for the wider world. The Crusaders had tasted pepper and cinnamon, and they were astonished. But nothing prepared them for sugar. Back in Europe, sweetness was a rare accident. Perhaps a handful of berries in summer, if the birds did not claim them first. Honey was known, yes, but it was scarce, tangled in combs, guarded by angry bees and costly to harvest. For most, sweetness was a memory more than a daily reality, fleeting and fragile. Then in the East, sugar appeared white crystals that sparkled in the sun, like ground quartz dissolving instantly on the tongue. It was not just sweet, it was dazzling, a rush of pleasure that seemed to light up the body from within. A crusader biting into candied fruit for the first time might have staggered with shock. His tongue trained on bread porridge and salted meat suddenly sang with joy. Almonds coated in sugar figs dripping with syrup cakes that melted in the mouth. These were revelations. One chronicler wrote that it was as if paradise itself had been poured into the mouth. Sugar was not only flavour, it was power. In the East, physicians used it as medicine mixed with herbs. It soothed the stomach, cooled fevers, and revived the weak. Apothecaries sold it in tiny jars as if it were gold dust. To eat sugar was to taste both healing and luxury, something that blurred the line between necessity and indulgence. For nobles, it became spectacle. Banquets glittered with sugar sculptures, castles, animals, even entire scenes moulded from the shining crystals. Guests gasped as these creations were broken and eaten. A display of wealth more dramatic than any jewel. To serve sugar was to announce prestige. For ordinary crusaders, it was a dangerous new craving. Many returned home unable to forget the taste, speaking of it like a dream. Imagine a night in a smoky tavern describing candied almonds to peasants who had never tasted sweetness beyond a bitter apple. His words made their mouths water. They longed for it without even knowing it. Sugar soon became the obsession of Europe's markets. Venetian merchants, already wealthy from spice, added sugar to their cargoes. Each shipment stirred excitement. In royal courts, sugar was guarded like treasure, handed out sparingly in gilded dishes. In monasteries, it was used in medicines, preserving fruits and mixing potions that blurred the sacred with the indulgent. But with craving came consequences. Sugar was not easy to grow. It required hot climates, fertile soil, and endless labour. Plantations in Cyprus and Sicily began to supply Europe, and with them came new systems of toil fields where workers bent under sun cutting cane with aching hands. Wealth for some meant hardship for others, as it so often does. Yet none of this dulled Europe's appetite. On the contrary, the rarity of sugar made it more precious. A pinch stirred into wine transformed it. A spoonful spread over bread turned a peasant's meal into a noble's feast. Sugar was luxury distilled, and once tasted, it was impossible to forget. And so quietly, Europe began to change. The craving for sweetness drove merchants to seek new routes, new suppliers, new lands where cane might grow. The hunger for sugar would centuries later shape voyages across oceans, fuel empires, and darken history with slavery. But in the time of the Crusades, it was still new, still magical, still half miracle in the eyes of those who first encountered it. Think of a crusader, weary and sunburned, standing in a market in Acre. He places a coin on the stall and receives a tiny sweet coated in sugar. He eats it slowly, each bite a wonder, each crystal a spark. He does not know he is part of something larger, that this sweetness will ripple through history like a stone dropped in water. He only knows that he has tasted joy. Back home, when he tells the tale, his neighbours shake their heads. Impossible, they say. No food can taste like that. But his eyes shine and he insists. And so the legend of sugar spreads before the sugar itself ever can. The Crusaders had set out for salvation. They found sweetness instead. And Europe, for all its darkness and struggle, would never lose the memory of that first crystalline rush. For when people discover joy, they do not forget. And joy, even when made of crystals of cane, has the power to change the world. The Crusaders had expected swords and arrows, but what truly threatened them was disease. Dysentery stalked their camps. Fever swept through tents. Wounds festered until infection turned them fatal. Back in Europe, medicine was crude. A barber surgeon might bleed a man until he fainted or bore a hole in his skull to release the demons. Herbs were given, yes, but often with more hope than science. Most cures were prayers and charms whispered in the shadows. Then in the East, the Crusaders met something astonishing. In cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, they encountered hospitals not just places of charity, but organised centres of healing. These Bemaristans, as they were called, were vast complexes with wards for different illnesses. Patients lay in clean beds, water flowed through fountains to refresh the air, and physicians studied symptoms instead of blaming sin. It was, to European eyes, a miracle. Imagine a wounded knight carried into such a place. He expects bloodletting or a priest's prayer. Instead, he is washed with clean water, his wound stitched carefully with silk thread, and herbs applied that soothe the pain. He is given broth rest and medicine that actually works. He recovers bewildered. He whispers to his comrades that the infidels know how to heal better than any priest at home. Crusaders also saw libraries of medical knowledge. Shelves heavy with texts by Galen and Hippocrates, preserved in Greek and expanded in Arabic. They read of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, a vast encyclopedia describing anatomy diagnosis and treatment with a clarity unknown in Europe. They saw physicians debating, experimenting, writing, treating medicine not as magic, but as study. One tale tells of a Frankish soldier who brought his fever-stricken brother to a Muslim doctor. The physician prescribed a light diet, herbs and rest. The soldier, impatient, handed the patient to a European barber surgeon instead. The surgeon shaved the man's head, sliced open his scalp to release bad humours, rubbed salt into the wound, and killed him within days. The Muslim doctor shook his head, remarking that some men prefer death by tradition to life by reason. The story spread grim and humbling. Beyond healing wounds, the Crusaders also witnessed the miracle of hygiene. In the East, baths were common. People washed regularly using soaps scented with herbs. Public bathhouses echoed with steam and chatter. To Crusaders unwashed for weeks, this was shocking, even suspicious. Some muttered that such bathing was sinful indulgence, but others could not deny its effect. Healthier skin, fewer sores, cleaner wounds. The habit of bathing began slowly to creep into European custom. There were also new remedies. Alcohol distilled and used as disinfectant. Syrups of sugar mixed with herbs for coughs. Surgical tools of iron and steel carefully designed for specific operations. Even the idea of checking a patient's pulse to judge illness seemed like sorcery to men used to priests declaring fevers as punishment for sin. Of course, the Crusaders did not suddenly turn into doctors. Many ignored what they saw, clinging to their old ways. Yet some carried the knowledge home. Monks copied texts, merchants smuggled manuscripts, and physicians translated works from Arabic into Latin. Slowly, painfully, Europe began to absorb what the East had preserved and expanded. And with that, the seeds of change were planted. Picture a monk in Paris bent over a desk by candlelight, translating Avicenna into Latin. His quill scratches the ink smudges, but slowly the words take form. From those words, students at the new universities learn of anatomy, diagnosis, treatment. They whisper of washing hands before surgery, of observing symptoms instead of guessing. Centuries later, medicine in Europe will rise from those seeds. The Crusaders did not understand it fully. They returned home speaking of strange practices of doctors who could read the body like a book of hospitals where order reigned instead of chaos. To their neighbours, it sounded like myth. But the truth was real. The Crusades had brought Europe into contact with a tradition of healing it had long forgotten. And so, beneath the noise of battles and the clatter of swords, another story was unfolding. A quieter story, a gentler one. The story of knowledge carried westward, of wounds that healed, of diseases that could be soothed. The Crusaders had marched for salvation, yet they returned with medicine. And though they could not yet know it, the lives of countless generations would be longer, safer, and healthier because of it. The Crusaders had thought the journey east was about holy purpose, about swords and salvation. But for others, especially those who stayed safely at home, the Crusades were about something far more practical: money. Enter Venice. In the late 11th century, Venice was a city of lagoons, its streets paved with water, its houses perched on wooden piles driven deep into mud. From a distance, it hardly seemed the stuff of empire. But its people had salt in their blood and silver in their eyes. Mariners, merchants and bankers, Venetians, saw opportunity where others saw danger. When Pope Urban II called men eastward, knights cheered. But Venice sharpened its quills, counted its coins, and prepared its ships. The Crusaders needed to cross the Mediterranean. They had no fleet, no plan for transport. Venice did, and Venice charged dearly. Ships were built, provisions, stocked, contracts signed. Knights paid with gold, silver, even promises of future plunder. From the very beginning, the Crusades were not only holy war, they were a business deal. And the Venetians were masters of the deal. They sold passage wine, grain, armour and weapons. Every Crusader army became a paying customer. And when Crusaders staggered home empty-handed, Venice still counted profit coin piled high in palaces along the canals. But Venice wanted more than money, it wanted dominance. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Venice revealed its ruthless genius. When crusaders could not pay for their ships, the Doge of Venice offered a bargain-sacked Zara, a Christian city, to cover the debt. Desperate and bound by contract, the crusaders agreed. Zara burned its churches looted not for Christ, but for creditors. Then came Constantinople. A Byzantine prince promised riches if the crusaders helped him reclaim his throne. Venice seized the chance. In April 1204, crusaders stormed the city, not Jerusalem, but Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom. Palaces were plundered, relics, stolen libraries torched. Bronze horses were pried from the hippodrome and shipped across the sea to Venice, where they still stand today, above St. Mark's Basilica. It was the greatest betrayal of the Crusades. Instead of defending Christianity, the Crusaders had gutted its most glorious city. And Venice, standing at the heart of the scheme, emerged rich beyond imagining. From that moment, Venice became more than a city, it became a power. Its navy dominated the seas. Its merchants controlled the spice trade. Its bankers lent to kings. While knights bled on foreign soil, Venice built palaces of marble, held glittering festivals, and masked its ruthlessness behind silken veils. Imagine a weary crusader limping home scarred and broke. His village cheered, but his purse was empty. Meanwhile, in Venice, merchants feasted on candied almonds, sipped sweet wines, and counted profits made from the same war. The contrast was bitter. Venice's rise was not only about wealth, it was about vision. The city understood before most that the Crusades had opened highways of trade. Spices, silk, sugar paper, all could flow westward if only someone controlled the routes. Venice seized that control. Its ships became the veins through which the lifeblood of commerce pulsed. Soon the lagoon glittered with wealth. Marble facades gleamed in the sun. Canals echoed with the songs of gondoliers. Masks, jewels, silks, all flaunted the city's prosperity. Foreign ambassadors arrived to marvel kings, sent envoys to borrow, and merchants across Europe dreamed of Venetian fortune. And still the Crusades bled on. Knights died, pilgrims marched, peasants starved. But behind the holy smoke of sermons, the counting houses of Venice told the real story. Profit had become the true faith. It is tempting to think of the Crusades only in terms of swords, crosses, and blood. Yet the rise of Venice reminds us that wars are also markets. Where there is chaos, there is commerce. Where there is faith, there is finance. And in that mix, Venice thrived. The Crusaders thought they were fighting for God. Venice knew they were fighting for gold. And so long after the Crusaders limped home, the city in the lagoon grew ever stronger. Its ships ruling the Mediterranean, its palaces blazing with treasure, its name etched into history not as a martyr of the Crusades, but as their greatest beneficiary. The Crusades began as holy war. Yet in time they became something stranger, something that feels almost modern. For the first time in European history, ordinary men and women signed up for what was in effect a packaged tour. In the villages of France, Germany and England, peasants listened to fiery sermons about Jerusalem. Priests spoke of relics, forgiveness, and the glory of walking where Christ once walked. For villagers who had never left the parish boundary, the idea was intoxicating. Travel was not for peasants until now, and so families packed what little they had. A sack of grain, a cooking pot, a crude wooden cross. They joined the flow of humanity, heading eastward not as soldiers, but as pilgrims. Some imagined they would see holy sites and return home with stories. Others hoped never to return, believing salvation lay at the journey's end. In practice, it resembled a medieval travel industry. Lords and bishops organised contingents. Venice and Genoa sold transport like modern airlines, offering ships in exchange for coin or promises. Contracts were signed, specifying dates, routes, and provisions. Even food was included: hard bread, salted meat, barrels of wine. It was the Middle Ages' first all-inclusive package. For the great lords, it was business. For the poor, it was pilgrimage. For both, it was travel on a scale Europe had never seen. The journey east had its itineraries. First Constantinople, the gateway to the east. Then Antioch, with its holy relics. Finally, Jerusalem, the prize itself. Along the way, pilgrims visited shrines, kissed relics, and bought souvenirs. Holy oil from Syria. tiny crosses carved from olive wood. Even fake relics, fragments of saints' bones that had never belonged to saints, were sold eagerly to travellers desperate for proof of their piety. Like tourists of later centuries, Crusaders sent letters home describing wonders. The city has domes like heaven itself, one knight wrote of Constantinople. Others marvelled at bazaars bursting with colour food, seasoned with spices and fruits they had never seen. These descriptions spread through Europe, igniting curiosity and envy. For the first time, the masses dreamed not only of salvation, but of travel. Not all was awe and wonder. Pilgrims grew sick, starved, and died by the roadside. Bandits attacked storms, wrecked ships, and hunger emptied bellies. Yet even in suffering, the shape of something new was forming organised large-scale travel, sustained by contracts, commerce, and expectation. The Venetians knew this better than anyone. They saw the crusade not only as war, but as transport. For the right price, they offered fleets of ships, schedules, and even pre-arranged stops at ports along the way. It was pilgrimage, bundled with logistics, faith mixed with commerce. If the Crusaders were God's travellers, the Venetians were their travel agents. There was too a kind of medieval group tour spirit. Knights and peasants who had never spoken to one another at home now trudged together on the same road. Songs were sung, tales exchanged, jokes shared. A knight might sit by a campfire listening to a peasant describe the taste of garlic soup, while the peasant marvelled at stories of castles. For a time, the rigid walls of class blurred, replaced by the shared rhythm of marching east. Of course, the illusion did not last. Hunger-sharpened divisions, lords demanded obedience, peasants grumbled. But still, for months or years at a time, thousands of people lived as one great caravan moving across continents like a single living creature. It is tempting to smile at the thought of the Crusades as package tours, but in truth, they opened Europe to the idea of mass travel. Pilgrimages had always existed, but the Crusades made them vast, international, organised. A farmer in Burgundy might meet a fisherman from Norway on the road to Jerusalem. A merchant from Genoa might trade with a knight from England in a camp outside Antioch. Never before had so many ordinary people from so many lands mingled in such numbers. The legacy was lasting. Travel stories became part of Europe's imagination. The tales of Crusaders, half true, half embroidered, sparked dreams of far-off lands. Children grew up hearing of domes of gold spices that burned the tongue fruits that dripped with honey. The world felt larger, stranger, and more enticing. And once people have glimpsed the wider world, they do not forget. Centuries later, when pilgrims walked to Santiago de Compostela, or when merchants sailed to India, the memory of the Crusades lingered in the background, proof that even the humblest villager could set out across seas and deserts, could see wonders and return with tales. It is ironic. The Crusades failed in their holy purpose. Jerusalem was won and lost, armies bled out, kingdoms crumbled. Yet in their failure, they succeeded in something else. They turned war into travel, pilgrimage, into tourism, faith, into an industry. The Crusades were not the first wars Europe had fought, but they were the first wars that looked suspiciously like organised tours. And in that strange mix of faith and logistics, they gave birth to something that would grow into the future, the idea that the world is open to be travelled, explored, and eventually conquered. The Crusaders marched east with sermons in their ears that painted the enemy in black and white. The Saracens, they were told, were godless, monstrous, wicked foes. To fight them was not only war, it was righteousness. But reality, as so often happens, proved far more complicated. When the Crusaders met the Muslim world, they discovered not only enemies, but rivals who commanded respect. At first, the encounters were brutal. Raids, ambushes, sieges, blood on the sand. Crusaders cursed their foes, calling them heathens, while Muslim poets wrote of the Franks as brutish, dirty, and savage. To each side, the other seemed alien. The clash of civilizations was sharp, and the early years of the Crusade were drenched in mistrust. Yet time has a way of softening even the hardest walls. As the wars dragged on, Crusaders and Muslims began to see each other not only as enemies, but as men. On battlefields, truces were struck so both sides could bury their dead. During sieges, envoys passed between camps carrying not only demands, but gifts. Spices, horses, silks, tokens of respect offered even while swords were drawn. Knights used to seeing themselves as paragons of chivalry found in Muslim leaders equals who embodied the same virtues, courage, generosity, honour. none more so than Saladin. To the Crusaders, Saladin was both terror and wonder. He had driven them from Jerusalem, yes, but he had also spared its people when he might have slaughtered them. He fought with relentless will, but he also gave mercy. Chroniclers wrote of him with a grudging admiration, some even comparing him to the greatest Christian kings. For European knights raised on tales of Arthur and Charlemagne, Saladin seemed like a figure out of their own legends, only born on the other side. Stories spread of his courtesy, how he sent fruit and snow to cool the fever of King Richard the Lionheart, how he returned a fallen enemy's body to his comrades for burial, how he prayed faithfully even as he waged war. For crusaders raised on sermons of cruelty, it was disarming, and admiration ran both ways. Muslim chroniclers, though scornful of the Franks' dirtiness and their clumsy ways, sometimes marvelled at their stubborn courage. They were few, yet they fought as if possessed. They clung to castles perched on impossible cliffs. They rode into hopeless battles with a kind of wild honour. They are lions in courage, one Arab writer admitted, though donkeys in understanding. The clash of cultures produced more than blood, it produced curiosity. Crusaders watched Muslims at prayer, bowing and kneeling 5 times a day, their voices rising in chants. Some mocked, others were moved. They saw order, devotion, discipline. Muslim scholars in turn watched the Crusaders stumble through Latin chants their churches bear compared to Eastern mosques, and wondered at the roughness of their piety. Even on the most hostile frontiers, the exchange of customs seeped in. Crusaders tasted new foods, wore Eastern fabrics, and sometimes adopted local ways of dress to cope with the heat. Muslim artisans built fortifications for Christian lords. Marriages rare but real joined families across the divide. Step by step, enemy and other became not only a foe, but a mirror. Of course, prejudice never vanished. Crusaders still spoke of Muslims as infidels, and Muslims called the Franks barbarians. But the boundaries were blurred by reality. When you fight someone year after year, you cannot help but learn who they are. And sometimes, against all odds, you find yourself respecting them. This perhaps was one of the strangest legacies of the Crusades. The wars were savage, yes. Atrocities stained both sides. But alongside the blood ran something unexpected: admiration. Crusaders carried home not only relics and spices, but stories of men they had hated, then grudgingly honoured. Think of a knight in a French hall long after the wars are over. He leans close to the fire, his grandchildren around him. He speaks of Saladin, a prince without equal, whose mercy shamed the cruelty of many Christians. The children listen wide-eyed, confused. How could an enemy be noble, yet the seed is planted? The world is not so simple. The other is not always monstrous. Sometimes he is human. And from such stories grew a subtle change in Europe. Tales of Saladin circulated not as warnings, but as lessons in virtue. Romances and epics cast him as a chivalric figure, almost a knight himself. In their enemies, Crusaders had found rivals who reshaped their own ideals of honour. It is tempting to imagine history as a clean clash, us versus them, light versus dark. But the Crusades remind us that even in the fiercest wars, admiration can sprout like wildflowers in a battlefield. The Crusaders discovered that the other was not only foe, but teacher. And in that uneasy respect lay the beginning of something fragile, something that would echo faintly into later centuries. The recognition that across borders, across faiths, men could still share courage, mercy, and honour. The Crusades were not only a meeting of faiths, they were a meeting of weapons walls and ideas. What Crusaders carried home was not just memory of domes and spices, but hard lessons of war. In Europe, castles were familiar things. Thick stone keeps squatting on hills ringed by moats or palisades. They were symbols of lordly power, built more to dominate peasants than to withstand great sieges. Their walls were thick, yes, but their designs were blunt. Then the Crusaders reached the east, and there, in the blistering sun of Syria and Palestine, they saw fortifications that redefined the art of defence. The great Muslim castles were not just walls, they were machines of stone. Layer upon layer of defences, with gates angled to trap invaders, towers staggered so arrows could crossfire cisterns, carved deep to store water during endless sieges. For the first time, Crusaders faced fortresses designed not to impress peasants, but to resist armies. They learned quickly, Nowhere was this clearer than at Crc de Chevaliers, the great Crusader fortress in Syria. Rising like a crown upon a hill, it was not a single wall, but a double ring of stone with towers so vast they could house garrisons within them. Its passages twisted to confuse invaders. Its storage rooms brimmed with grain. Its reservoirs held months of water. It was less a castle than a small city of war, designed to outlast any siege. Crusaders absorbed these ideas and carried them home. Soon Europe's castles began to change. Gone were squat keeps. In their place rose concentric castles with rings of walls, layered defences and towers that bristled with innovation. From Wales to the Rhine, fortresses grew more sophisticated, each one a child of lessons learned in the East. And it was not only walls, it was weapons. The crossbow, feared and despised, came into its own during the Crusades. In Europe, it had been controversial, so deadly that the Church once tried to ban it, declaring it unchristian to use against fellow Christians. But in the East, against armoured foes, it proved invaluable. A peasant with a crossbow could pierce a knight's mail, could strike terror into horsemen who had long thought themselves invincible. Crusaders returned with new respect for the weapon. Slowly, grudgingly, the crossbow became part of European arsenals, a weapon that shifted the balance of power from noble knight to common soldier. They also saw Greek fire, that mysterious liquid flame used by the Byzantines. Launched from tubes or pots, it clung to ships, to men burning even on water. Crusaders watched it in awe and horror, desperate to learn its secrets, but the formula remained jealously guarded. Still, the memory of it haunted them, inspiring experiments in fire and powder that centuries later would lead to new kinds of warfare. Siege engines too evolved. Crusaders had long used battering rams and ladders, but in the East, they encountered counterweight trebuchets, mighty machines that hurled stones the size of oxen with terrifying force. Walls shattered under their blows. Towers crumbled, men were crushed in their shadow. Soon, European engineers built their own, perfecting the designs, spreading them from castle to castle, until no lord could ignore their power. Even smaller innovations mattered. New forms of armour, influenced by Eastern lamellar plates, began to appear in Europe. Helmets lengthened to protect the face. Chainmail grew finer and denser. Shields shifted from kite-shaped to shorter designs, better for close combat. Step by step, war itself was remade. But perhaps the greatest change was not the weapons themselves, it was the mindset. Before the Crusades, European warfare was local, feudal, small. A raid here, a siege there. After the Crusades, war had become international, strategic, infused with the knowledge of engineers, merchants and scholars. The Crusaders had glimpsed the scale of battles fought in the East, the sophistication of fortifications, the ingenuity of weapons. They returned with a new respect for planning, for supply, for engineering. Picture a knight back home in France overseeing the construction of a new castle. He no longer dreams only of lording over peasants. He imagines enemies, siege engines, trebuchets. He orders a second wall-angled towers, deeper wells. His peasants grumble at the labour, but the knight insists. He has seen the East and he knows that war is changing. Picture a peasant conscript handed a crossbow. For the first time, he can kill a knight without needing armour or horse. The weapon empowers him, frightens his betters, and shifts the balance of battlefield power forever. The Crusades, for all their blood and folly, had become a school of war. Europe graduated, changed. Castles rose higher and stronger. Weapons grew deadlier. And the art of battle moved one step closer to the future. The Crusaders thought they had gone east for holy glory. In truth, they returned with new ways to build, to fight, and to kill. And from those lessons, Europe's landscape of stone and steel was remade. The Crusades were at their core holy wars. But to many who set out, they were also pilgrimages, journeys not only to fight, but to see, to touch, to carry something sacred home. From the very beginning, relics were at the heart of crusading imagination. Europe already revered them, bones of saints kept in jeweled boxes, splinters of the true cross locked in altars, vials of holy oil passed down through generations. Relics made holiness tangible. To touch them was to brush against eternity. So when word spread that the East was filled with relics, pilgrims came running. Jerusalem was not only Christ's city, it was a treasure house of holy memory. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre said, To cover the tomb of Christ drew tears from those who entered. Pilgrims scraped dust from its floor into tiny pouches, believing it would heal the sick at home. Others chipped bits of stone from Calvary itself, carrying fragments of salvation in their saddlebags. Merchants were quick to see opportunity. In bazaars, relic sellers set up stalls beside spice merchants. They offered splinters of the true cross thorns from the crown, even drops of Christ's blood preserved in crystal. Many were real, many more were forgeries. But pilgrims did not care. Faith made every relic true. Some of the most famous treasures of Europe arrived in this way. After the sack of Constantinople in 1204, Crusaders shipped relics by the cartload back west. Churches in Paris, Venice, and Cologne suddenly claimed to own pieces of the true cross, the robe of the Virgin, even entire saints' bodies spirited out of Eastern shrines. Pilgrims flocked to see them, and towns grew rich on offerings left at their altars. The trade in relics became an industry. Pilgrims bought small tokens crosses carved from olive wood bottles of holy water from the Jordan River, bits of cloth touched to shrines. These souvenirs were worn as charms, proof that the pilgrim had walked in Christ's footsteps. Back in Europe, they became heirlooms passed down through families as sacred inheritance. But relics were not only about faith, they were about power. To possess a great relic was to possess prestige. Kings vied to gather the monasteries, guarded them jealously, and bishops used them to draw pilgrims and their coin to their cathedrals. A church with a relic was not just a church, it was a destination. The Crusaders, often poor and ragged, sometimes found relics more valuable than gold. A knight might sell his sword for a splinter of the true cross. A peasant might starve, but keep the vial of holy water he had carried across seas. To them, relics were not just objects, they were bridges to heaven, investments in eternity. Yet even here, admiration for the East slipped in. Crusaders saw Muslim pilgrims travelling to Mecca carrying water from the sacred Zamzam, well stones from holy places and tokens blessed by their journey. Though faiths differed, the instinct was the same, to take home a piece of holiness, to make the invisible visible. Perhaps in some unspoken way, both sides recognized each other in this. Back in Europe, the impact was enormous. Pilgrimage grew into a movement. Roads to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome thronged with travellers. Churches displayed relics with pride, their jewelled reliquaries gleaming in candlelight. Towns prospered as inns, markets, and hospitals sprang up to serve the endless flow of pilgrims. Faith had become an economy, but beneath the commerce there was still yearning. A pilgrim clutching a bone fragment in Cologne or a stone chip in Chartres was not thinking of profit. He was thinking of salvation, of carrying a piece of the holy close to his heart, of believing that heaven could be touched through wood, bone, or stone. Imagine a peasant woman, her hands rough from work, holding a tiny cross said to contain a splinter of Calvary. To her, it is not fraud or trade. It is hope. Hope that her sick child might recover, that her soul might find peace, that her life of toil might be crowned by grace. That was the true power of relics, not their authenticity, but their meaning. The Crusaders in their bloody march carried home much that was worldly spices, silk money, and power. But they also carried this traffic in holiness, this conviction that sacred memory could be bottled, chipped, or sewn into cloth. In their wake, Europe became a continent of pilgrims, forever moving towards shrines, forever yearning to touch what was beyond reach. And though centuries have passed, the legacy lingers. Relics still gleam in cathedrals. Pilgrims still walk roads worn by their ancestors. And in the quiet flicker of candles before a reliquary, one can still feel the longing of a crusader who so many centuries ago bent his knee in Jerusalem and scraped a handful of holy dust into his pouch. When the Crusaders first marched east, they thought in absolutes conquer-convert control. Yet what they built in the Holy Land turned out to be something stranger and more complicated. They carved out states' kingdoms perched on foreign soil that became crossroads between worlds. The most famous was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in 1099 after the blood-drenched capture of the Holy City. But there were others: the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa. To Europeans, these seemed like islands of Christendom planted in alien seas. But in reality, they were fragile bridges between cultures. Life in these Crusader states was nothing like life in a French village or German castle. For one thing, The land itself was different. The climate was hotter, the soil unfamiliar. European crops withered, so settlers adopted local ones: olives, citrus fruits, figs. Wheat gave way to barley. Instead of meadows of cows, they tended goats and camels. Daily survival meant learning from the very people they had conquered. The architecture shifted too. Crusader castles fused European stonework with Eastern design. They rose in concentric rings with angled gates and hidden cisterns, less like the squat keeps of France, more like the fortresses of Syria. Houses borrowed flat roofs from Arab builders, better suited for catching breezes in the sweltering heat. Even churches bore traces of Eastern style, with domes and mosaics unfamiliar to Western eyes. And then there was language. Crusaders who stayed did not remain strangers for long. French knights picked up Arabic words. Local Christians spoke Greek and Syriac. Merchants haggled in a mishmash of tongues: Latin mixed with Arabic, Greek with French. Children grew up bilingual, sometimes trilingual. To live in these kingdoms was to live between worlds. Food followed the same pattern. A knight who once dined on cabbage and salted pork now ate rice flavoured with spices, lamb stewed with cinnamon pomegranates sprinkled across his plate. European women learned recipes from local cooks. Arab healers mixed herbs into medicines for Frankish patients. At first, Crusaders treated these customs with suspicion, but in time they embraced them. Culture seeped through the cracks as it always does. Marriage was another crossroads. Though rare at first, intermarriage did occur. Crusader lords sometimes married local Christian women, cementing alliances with Greek or Armenian families. Children of mixed heritage grew up in castles, carrying both Latin and Eastern traditions. Even if the Crusaders had dreamed of domination, reality was more complicated. Survival required blending. Yet beneath this exchange lay tension. The Crusader kingdoms were always precarious, surrounded by larger, stronger Muslim powers. Their survival depended on constant reinforcements from Europe and fragile truces with neighbours. Many settlers lived in fear, their castles bristling with watchtowers, their farms fortified against raids. Every truce was temporary, every harvest shadowed by the threat of attack. Still, there were moments of peace. Trade flowed across borders, for even enemies needed goods. Muslim merchants sold spices and silks in Crusader markets. Frankish knights sold timber and weapons. Pilgrims arrived from Europe, crowding the holy sites, buying relics and souvenirs. In these markets, Muslim, Christian and Jewish traders haggled side by side, proving that commerce often succeeds where politics fails. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the Crusader kingdoms was their hybridity. They were not simply Europe transplanted, they were new creations shaped by necessity and contact. Crusaders learned irrigation from local farmers. They adopted military strategies from Muslim foes. They built cities where Latin cathedrals stood beside mosques and synagogues, each community negotiating its space within the fragile balance. To Europeans who visited the Crusader states, seemed exotic, half familiar and half foreign. Pilgrims marvelled at churches filled with Eastern mosaics, at markets bursting with scents unknown in Paris or Cologne. To locals, the Franks were strange, rude and often brutal, but also oddly adaptable. Over time, the sharp line between us and them blurred, if only slightly. But fragility was always the reality. The Crusader kingdoms were never secure. Each generation faced siege, famine or betrayal. Cities changed hands, castles fell, alliances crumbled. By the late 13th century, the tide turned decisively against them. One by one, the Crusader states were swallowed by stronger Muslim powers. Until finally in 1291, Acre, the last great stronghold, fell, and the dream of permanent Christian states in the Holy Land ended. And yet, though the stones crumbled, the memory endured. The Crusader kingdoms had been cultural laboratories where East and West touched, clashed and mingled. Their legacy was not only blood, but exchange foods, words, ideas, art. They showed that even in war, humans borrow, adapt and blend. Picture a child born in Jerusalem around 1150, the son of a Frankish knight and a local Christian woman. He speaks French to his father, Greek to his grandmother, Arabic to the servants. He eats bread dipped in olive oil, prays in a Latin church, but grows up playing with Muslim children in the streets. To him, identity is not simple. It is layered, complex, woven from many strands. That child is the true emblem of the Crusader kingdoms. The Crusaders had marched east to impose their world. What they created instead were crossroads, messy, fragile, vibrant places where cultures collided and coexisted. For a brief, flickering moment, Europe and the East lived not only as enemies, but as neighbours. And though those kingdoms vanished, the memory of that crossroads remained proof that history is never just conquest, but contact. The Crusades ended, but their echoes never truly faded. By the late 13th century, the dream of permanent Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land had collapsed. Acre, the last great stronghold, fell in 1291. The Crusaders who survived scrambled onto ships glancing back at the burning city as the waves carried them westward. After nearly 2 centuries of war, Europe's foothold in the East was gone. Yet in a sense, the Crusades never ended at all. For what the Crusaders brought back reshaped Europe far more than what they carried east. They failed in their holy mission. They failed to hold Jerusalem, but they succeeded in changing their own world. They returned with the memory of spices that turned bland gruel into feasts. Cinnamon, pepper cloves, saffron. These flavours lit a hunger in Europe that would drive centuries of trade and exploration. From those cravings would come voyages across oceans, the discovery of new worlds, even the birth of global empires. They returned with the taste of sugar, a sweetness so intoxicating that Europe could not let it go. At first, it was a luxury for kings. Then it became a necessity for all. And in pursuit of sugar plantations were built, slavery spread, and history bent toward both wonder and tragedy. They returned with books and knowledge fragments of Greek science preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, all slowly seeped into European minds. From these seeds would grow the universities, the Renaissance, the very idea that reason and observation could change the world. They returned with visions of architecture domes that floated arches that soared cathedrals filled with light. From those visions rose Gothic spires that still crown Europe today, stone prayers carved into the sky. They returned with technologies of war crossbows that pierced armour castles that resisted armies, trebuchets that shattered walls. From these, Europe learned to fight on a new scale, preparing itself, whether it knew it or not, for even greater wars to come. They returned with memories of enemies who became teachers. Saladin, once feared as a ruthless foe, became in European memory a model of chivalry. Crusaders carried stories of his honour, his mercy, his greatness. And in those tales they began, however faintly, to see that even the other could be admirable, even noble. They returned with commerce. Venice, Genoa, Pisa all rose on the tide of crusading trade. The Mediterranean became a highway of goods and ideas. Merchants who once sold grain now sold silk. Bankers who once counted pennies now financed kings. From the ruins of war, new wealth flowed. And they returned with stories. Tales of domes that glittered like heaven markets, filled with jewels. Foods that tasted like joy. Tales of deserts that stretched forever, cities that seemed eternal, and enemies who fought like lions. These stories, told by firelight in villages, expanded imaginations. They whispered to peasants that the world was larger, stranger, richer than they had ever guessed. The Crusades did not unite Christendom as the Pope had dreamed. In fact, they fractured it further, souring relations with Byzantium, deepening hatred between faiths, and leaving scars that have not yet healed. They were brutal, wasteful, and often tragic. But paradoxically, they were also bridges. Bridges of trade, of culture, of knowledge. They dragged Europe out of its narrow world and thrust it into contact with something greater. The Crusaders marched east to conquer, but instead they were conquered by flavours, by books, by beauty, by ideas. It is easy centuries later to see only the blood. And there was blood, oceans of it. Cities sacked, people, slaughtered, holy places desecrated. The Crusades were not noble, they were not clean, they were full of horror. But history is rarely one thing. Alongside destruction came discovery. Alongside hate came admiration. Alongside death came knowledge. The Crusaders thought they had lost, but in truth they had changed. And because of that change, Europe itself was reborn. Imagine a peasant in a French village centuries after the last Crusader ship sailed. He sprinkles pepper on his stew, a spice his ancestors first tasted in Antioch. Above him rises a Gothic cathedral, its windows glowing with coloured glass, built with knowledge carried back by men who had seen domes in Constantinople. In the monastery nearby, scholars pore over translations of Arabic texts, rediscovering Aristotle, Galen, Euclid. A merchant in town counts coins using Arabic numerals faster than his grandfather could with Roman ones. All of it Pepper Cathedral's books numbers flows from the Crusades. The soldiers who bled on foreign soil may have thought they failed. But the world they returned to was not the same. Europe had opened its eyes and it could not close them again. And so the Crusades live on. Not only in battles remembered, but in every grain of sugar dissolved in tea, in every spice shaken onto bread, in every cathedral spire rising toward heaven. They live on in the mingling of cultures, in the clash that created bridges as well as wounds. The Crusades ended with failure, but their legacy is everywhere. And perhaps that is the paradox of history, that even in folly, even in tragedy, humanity cannot help but learn, borrow and change. The Crusaders went out seeking salvation. What they found was the world.